Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and I am delighted to welcome you here all tonight. As you can see, this is a very popular topic, and so thank you for your patience as we seated the wait list, who I'm pleased to say we were able to accommodate. The Artisan Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. We'd also like to express our thanks to the New York Landmarks Conservancy for their help in promoting tonight's lecture. Tonight's talk is part of Archtober, a celebration of New York City's architecture and design throughout the month of October that features hundreds of architectural events related to New York City. For those of you less familiar with the General Society, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. The General Society was founded in 1785. We are an organization that is 234 years old. Today, our organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our lecture series, of which course tonight is part of, and that lecture series is nearly 200 years old. Our General Society Library, of course, which you're sitting in at the moment, and our General Society Library, I'm delighted to say, will be celebrating 200 years next year. We also have a tuition-free Mechanics Institute. And finally, something I encourage you to visit afterwards if you have time, we have the John M. Mossman Lock Collection, so please feel free to visit that afterwards. You will find an informational postcard on the General Society on your seat, and if anyone is interested in library membership, you will find information on that on our library desk. As I mentioned, this is such a popular topic, and we are so pleased tonight to welcome Paul M. Kaplan, who will chronicle the story of the original Penn Station, which is eloquently described in Mr. Kaplan's book, The Original Penn Station. And I do want to mention this wonderful book, which is so informative, is for sale, and Mr. Kaplan will be signing books after his talk this evening. Paul Kaplan is Marketing Director for the Publishing, Technology, Educational and Financial Industries, and a prolific writer. His books include Jewish New York, A History and Guide to Neighborhoods, Synagogues and Eateries, and Jewish South Florida. Other books include Lillian Wald, America's Great Social and Healthcare Reformer, and Content Marketing for Success, Build Your Brand, and Generate Leads. Future titles include Progressive Era, 1819 to 1920, in New York, and a biography on Irving Berlin. Mr. Kaplan earned a BA in Ethics, Politics, and Economics from Yale College, and this was followed by an MBA from the Yale School of Management. It is a huge pleasure to introduce to you tonight Paul Kaplan.
Well, terrific. Thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see you here. How are we doing with sound? Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Awesome. Terrific. So I just wanted to thank Karen and her team for putting this great event together. They've done a great job, and recognize you all for coming. We actually have in the audience someone who took pictures of the original Penn Station, Norman McGrath, some of whose photos are in the book as well. So that's kind of exciting. So I think we are going to have some good education. We'll have some fun along the way, and I'll ask you some questions. So one thing I ask is just hold your questions to the end, and if you can, just turn off your cell phone as well. So with that, let's kind of dive in here. So just to let you know the website, this is a great way for us to stay in touch afterwards, paulkaplanauthor.com. This also has some radio shows, that I was a guest on, that cover material that we're not going to talk about in this talk, if you're interested in that, and you can kind of get a little more background, and feel free to email me. I really do answer the audience emails that come through this. These are some of the other books that were mentioned. Won't spend much time here, just in 3 different series. A lot of you know about the landmarking conservation, so this is very much about preserving and educating on history and culture through these different forms as well. Okay, so with that, let's dive into our topic, original Penn Station. So I think we have to kind of start from the beginning here and realize that the Pennsylvania Railroad was actually one of the most influential companies in the world. And it was certainly the largest employer in the US. So as you know, after the Civil War, there was the Transcontinental Railroad. It developed the nation. It was all these different train tracks that intertwined. And these companies were really at the forefront of a lot of the Industrial Revolution. But there's a problem. No matter how powerful this company is, they have a vexing issue. They can't connect their train lines into Manhattan. So basically, if you were a passenger and you wanted to come to Manhattan, you would take the train to the edge of New Jersey. You would have to get off and take a ferry. And this was very inconvenient to the passengers. It was said that every 10 minutes, a Pennsylvania Railroad ferry headed across the Hudson, threatening a gauntlet of ocean-going ships, ferries operated by railroads. There was this huge congestion, because things were much more congested back then in the waterway. And it was actually a very seedy place when you got off. And not only that, it was like this bottleneck. It was less efficient. That means less passengers that can go through the line, and it also was inefficient for the freight, which was an important part of the business. So, this was something that the presidents kind of thought about. They thought about building a bridge, right? No one would have thought of a tunnel. So they decided to do like a co-op version, and the different railroad companies would sponsor or co-sponsor this bridge. Did it work? No. They balked at the cost, and they said, there's no way we're going to do it. So the Pennsylvania Railroad, they're feeling a little bit like left at the party, kind of, and they realize if we're going to do something to connect to Manhattan, we are going to have to do this alone. So I kind of say that the Pennsylvania Railroad was more than a company, though. Think of it as like a brand, to use a very contemporary word. It's like Google today. So this would be like telling Google, users can't search 20% of the internet just because of your technology. Sorry about that. So Google would say, well, no, we're Google. We have to find a way to do this. And that was the kind of mindset that the Pennsylvania Railroad had. Okay, so one question is what was happening as far as Grand Central. So the Pennsylvania Railroad also looked at with some envy at their formidable competitor, Grand Central Depot. So this did connect to Manhattan. Trains ran from upstate New York through the east bank of the Hudson River, near the Harlem River, and into Manhattan. So there were bridges over the Harlem River at Spuyten and Duyvil. So Cornelius Vanderbilt, he started the Grand Central Depot in 1871. It was then in Nowheresville, right? But it developed actually much faster. And he was known as being more greedy, more corrupt, not much concern for passengers, and there were a lot of safety accidents, which is why the depot had to be rebuilt, and then eventually what we have today in 1913. But they were able to connect Manhattan, at least to go to upstate. So the Pennsylvania Railroad Company is thinking, wait a minute, we should be able to do this. So there's Alexander Cassatt. Now, does anyone know who's to the right of Alexander Cassatt? His sister? What's that? Mary Cassatt, right. The famed Impressionist artist who's done a lot of kind of like child-rearing scenes that you might know. There's actually a US stamp of her. Ironically, she is very well known in history. He is not, though. So Alexander Cassatt was a different kind of businessman. He was very integrally involved with the Pennsylvania Railroad. And at age 42, the president of Pennsylvania Railroad dies. And Alexander is passed over to be the president. He's pretty irked about that. And he says, okay, you know what, I'm just gonna go into retirement. He came from a family of means, and the successor to the president, he was basically like a company man and had very little imagination. A trade pub opined, he is by no means a genius. So Alexander Cassatt, he's in his life of retirement in Pennsylvania. He's visiting his sister Mary in Europe. That's it for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. Well, the then current president of the Pennsylvania Railroad also dies in office. And then the board finally asks Cassatt, now it's been like 15 years, and they say, we want you to come on as president. So he kind of hesitates. Wait a minute, the last two people died in office. And also, I'm kind of enjoying my whole retirement thing. I don't know about this. But he had that vision, and still, New Jersey was not connected to Manhattan. So he decides that he wants to do it, but he says to the board in so many words, I need to do what I need to do in this job. I'm going to take risks. And board, if you're going to micromanage me and you're going to be on my back, I don't want the job. And the board is like, well, wait a minute, we don't know about this. But they kind of think about it and they decide, and ultimately they decide to go ahead and offer him the job. So when Cassatt comes back, society and New York City had really changed. It's important to take a look at this difference in history because it very much affected the company and the business that we are talking about today. So now when Alexander Cassatt is coming back, it's the 1890s. This is the progressive era. So the world was changing, there were many significant reforms, and the population of New York City from 1860 to 1910, just to jump ahead, but the 50 years, went from something, it multiplied astronomically. So something to kind of point out here is there's the antitrust, right, under Teddy Roosevelt and the breaking up of a lot of these monopolies. And there were all kinds of kickbacks that were happening with oil companies and steel companies and the railroad, and everyone looked the other way. Well, Teddy Roosevelt, when he gets into office, is saying, no more, not under my watch. Alexander Cassatt wants to run a clean shop. He doesn't want a lot of these kickbacks. There's also large infrastructure projects. Don't forget, probably the most important thing, since Cassatt has been with the railroad, electricity comes. So you have this mindset. You also have labor rights. Labor is demanding many more concessions. There's a lot more unions. There's more strikes. This, again, affects the management-labor relations, though the relationship with labor with the Pennsylvania Railroad was actually very good for the most part. And then just the other one I'll mention is conservation. So a lot of land that's being conserved. If you're the Pennsylvania Railroad, this is something you have to think about now. You can't just buy up land pretty much wherever you want and develop it. So Alexander Cassatt is kind of coming in to this new environment, and he's still feeling discouraged, okay? He is still trying to find that way to connect to Manhattan. He doesn't know how. He goes to Europe again. So while he's in Europe, Samuel Rey, the VP of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, suggests that he visit the Gare d'Orsay in Paris. So Cassatt is absolutely amazed at what he sees. He is spending days viewing the station. He's looking how it's powered. The trains are powered by electricity. They run in the tunnels under the Seine. They're more safe. They're more comfortable. And he's looking to Europe, and he's saying, maybe we should think about this. The Gare d'Orsay has white limestone, the stately clock tower. It has these graceful arches. And Cassatt turns to Charles Jacobs, his chief engineer, and he says, I want to have something like this in my Penn Station, and you need to figure out how to make this work. So Jacobs is like, wow, that's quite an undertaking. But he was actually a very well-respected engineer, and he was respected at all different levels of the organization. He was known as an engineer who would get his hands dirty and had a lot of experience at different levels, and he had also worked on the PATH line previously. But the Hudson was not necessarily hospitable to tunnels, and there was also enormous corruption in New York, which we'll talk about a little later, but with Tammany Hall, a lot of bureaucracy that they're going to have to deal with. So, the key players, I mentioned Samuel Rey, the vice president. He came from a more working class background. he worked his way up the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. He started working at age 13, which was not that unusual. He was a big picture thinker. He was the strategy guy. He's the one that gave Cassatt a lot of these ideas in the first place. I mentioned Charles Jacobs, the chief engineer, not your typical engineer, admired at different levels of the company. And then Charles McKim of McKim, Mead, and White. What did McKim, Mead, and White design? That's right across the street. The Harvard Club of New York, exactly. So they were the premier architecture company in the country, pretty much. But there's one thing. They've never designed a railroad station. So you've got to remember, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, they could have whoever they want as an architecture company. But even though they could, Cassatt and the board decide that they want to go with Charles McKim because he really knew classical art. And that's what they were going for. He appreciated beauty. It said that he saw beauty wherever it was, and he insisted that things kind of played along in that parameter. So he has this huge undertaking that's more visionary. It's not just an execution project. So Cassatt taps McKim. Here are some quotes. Hilary Ballon, the historian, a monument to express the importance of the railroad, the ambitions of New York City, to have that manifested, that captured sense of itself. And Paul Goldberger, who's a former architectural critic of the New York Times, he says that Cassatt had a grand vision. He wanted the station to stand for the grandest, the noblest, the most elegant, and the most inspiring. Okay, but easier said than done. So, one area that McKim goes to, kind of for inspiration and some vacation, is the Baths of Caracalla. All right, who here has been to Rome? Okay, how many of you have been to the Baths of Caracalla at Rome? Great, okay. So, the Baths of Caracalla, for those of you who don't know, is from 200 AD, the Roman Empire. It was like a complex set of gyms, pools, spas, libraries, social centers. And the cost for the Romans was low. It was something that the average Roman could afford. And it was also about inspiring the citizenry, saying, we're the Roman Empire, and this is Rome. And this is, one of our amazing feats. Never mind that 200 years before that, the Roman Empire said, we don't like spas. They're for the Greeks. They're lazy. Then they like the spas. And one thing that McKim notices is the frigidarium. Okay, so this is a monumental hall similar to a basilica. And if you look on the left here, this is what it looks like today. Okay? Right now, if you went to Baths of Caracalla, you would see this as the frigidarium. This is, you could put the glasses on, and you could see like the drawing of what it would have looked like. So this is this, which is pretty cool, right? So McKim would have to imagine what this looked like. But this idea, this defined space, and this is what inspires him to think about the great waiting hall in the New York Penn Station. What other station in the US did this inspire besides Penn Station? Chicago's Union Station, among other public buildings. So the idea here is that it served as a meeting point for the bathgoers. So this is where the bathgoers would go, and then they would go to other rooms, and its central location made it the fulcrum for movements of them, just like a waiting room. So McKim starts to think about this defined space. He is definitely moved by a lot of the graceful arches, the way that it's designed, and he gets a lot of these ideas from there. Okay, he also gets inspiration for the stations for the entrance to the Acropolis and also the Piazza of St. Peter's. In St. Peter's Square, how it's presented. When you walk into St. Peter's Square, you immediately feel something different. It's not just physically going there. It's an energetic thing. You feel like I'm in a special place. And you feel that way even today with a lot of the way the columns are laid out, the way the space is defined with the fountains. This is what they're going for. None of this just functional, purely utilitarian architecture will do. So with that said, now they have to think about a neighborhood. So actually, believe it or not, they think about the Tenderloin District. So the Tenderloin District is where Penn Station is today. And it was known as a seedy neighborhood. It had a lot of gambling and rowdy saloons. And it was extremely corrupt. Okay, I mean, this was like payoff city, even more than other parts of the city. So it's pretty unlikely for a station to be built there. Why was it called the Tenderloin District? What? Have to do with meat? No, the meatpacking district would be considered a different area, but a good try. This was called the Tenderloin District because Alexander Williams, Clubber Williams, who was probably one of the most corrupt policemen in New York City history, said, you know, I've been having steak since I've been on the police force. Now that I'm assigned to this beat, I'm going to dine on tenderloin. That's why. All the payoffs from a lot of the brothels, the saloons, and this area was also known as clip joints. What's a clip joint? No, most audiences haven't heard of that one. I had one who did. A clip joint would be basically an accomplice would meet you, but you don't know that it's an accomplice, invite you to dinner, perhaps, or for a drink. Then everything's very friendly. Then the bill would arrive at 5 times the price. The accomplice is gone, and the bill comes, you know, that's very inflated, and a bouncer arrives to enforce payment. And the unsuspecting tourist would be very ripped off. This area had a lot of that too. But it also had a lot of redeeming features. It was where different social classes met. It also had a lot of property owners. And this also was an important area for African American citizens before Harlem became very big later in the early 20th century and then into the golden age of Harlem. But there was some civil unrest, though, between the different races and the police. So this was a pretty unlikely place, but this kind of speaks to Cassatt's vision. He thought that, and I'm going to use a very contemporary word, they wouldn't use a word like this back then, gentrify. He thought, oh, we could gentrify this area, the station, we can make it better. And so, also, there were some practical reasons why they wanted it, and there's some reasons why they couldn't have it all the way on 11th Avenue. But it is, you know, a very big risk to have something like that where they were, and that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so the PRR, that's the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, I'll be referring to that as PRR, they hire realtors to buy up properties. These realtors have no idea why they're buying these properties, because that is a closely guarded secret. Because if word got out that the largest company in the world, basically, was buying real estate, the prices would have shot through the roof. So they buy up properties. I always try to put things in today's dollars because it doesn't mean much to say. It actually wasn't that much in today, by Manhattan standards because it was a more downtrodden area. So the properties were between about $150,000 and $2.5 million. The problem they had wasn't necessarily so much the prices as finding the owners. And there's all kinds of stories about how they tried to do that. So word kind of leaks out about this. But no one would have thought that it would be like this whole station and all these tunnels. That was unthinkable. But there's kind of like some leaks about something. They're not just buying these properties randomly. So you start to get some homeowners who hold out. Now, I went through all not all, but much of the Pennsylvania Railroad archives, and I looked for clues like this. And I looked for court documentation, telegrams, and one of the things that I found was eminent domain. So they did use eminent domain, because I saw it for myself in the archives, to basically use the law to say, too bad, we're taking your property. Because otherwise they would never get to build it. So a lot of interesting things about that. But one thing you have to remember is there's a little bit of panic that ensues a lot of times. Now, this is the point of no return for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. Like, they've already now bought all these properties. So there's a little bit of like, are we going to buy all the properties? Is this going to work? How are we going to do these tunnels? But that's the whole thing. They're in this so deep, they've got to keep going. Even though I read about a lot of doubt in letters between executives that I saw in the archives. So another thing they have to deal with is Tammany Hall corruption, right? And so there's a lot of, now the question is going to be who is going to build the station? And that is going to be a free and fair process, right? Judging by ethics and rules and fair market value. No, of course not. there's veiled threats of selection of a contractor for a new station. So basically, Tammany Hall would say, we have this vendor that we would like you to choose. You don't have to, but if you don't, oh, you're interested in a subway stop here? Yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to do that. Oh, you need this permit? Yeah, I don't think we're going to get you that permit. Basically, they're going to make their life really difficult. Cassatt is in a bind. He decides, forget it, I'm going with my own vendor. I'm going with an engineering company that I know is going to do a fantastic job. Well, after that's announced, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company gets a visit from an interested party. And this person says, yeah, you're going to go with our company. Yeah, otherwise this isn't going to work out. And they pretty much threaten the vendor who's selected, and that vendor drops out. So Cassatt really has no choice, and they sort of like end up going for the one that Tammany Hall insists. That was a whole nother piece. But then there's the whole question, and this is the biggest challenge of everything we're talking about tonight. Because a lot of what we talked about is like politics and this and that. This is about the tunneling. You've got to remember, tunneling was a brand new concept to a lot of people, and a lot of engineers at the time really did not know how to do it well. Engineering News Record, which is still around today, they call this the most extensive and difficult piece of submarine tunnel work ever undertaken. So, this is like, they basically say, we really admire that you are building these tunnels. It's an amazing feat if you could do it. It's going to advance engineering. Good luck. We don't think you can do it. That was basically what they said. So that was a little discouraging for them. The other piece with this is the actual laborers, the Sandhogs, who were the tunnel builders. So the way it worked on the Hudson River side is you would have some Sandhogs on the New Jersey side beginning the tunneling and some on the Manhattan side. And the idea is that they would meet in the middle. Now, it was extremely grueling work. We have to appreciate how difficult this was for the Sandhogs. It was a contained space. I wanted to show you a quote as well, which I'll get to, so you can really hear the words from a Sandhog. They had to watch all the time for blowouts, because when there was a blow of compressed air, the pressure would drop in the tunnel, and then the results could be catastrophic. Escaping air would create a geyser, and that would be a sign of enormous trouble, and there would usually be a lot of running and deaths that would ensue. Another thing was the bends was a very painful and life-threatening condition. So while a lot of these Sandhogs were working on the tunnels, it actually felt okay, believe it or not, from a lot of journal entries that I read. But once they came back to the surface, if they came too quickly, it would be extremely painful and life-threatening. So the bends was literally, it was so painful that they would be bent over. That's why it's called the bends. And you probably hear about that from some divers and so on. So another piece was, as they're actually advancing the tunnels, a lot of the work is erased because you have all this sediment that keeps racing in. So engineering-wise, how do you keep out all this dirt when they're building the tunnel? So they came up with this ingenious idea, which I don't really get into too much in this talk, but it's in the book, they built these massive rings that were many tons, and they were under the water, and each of them had a different compartment that a different Sandhog was in. And these rings would advance as the tunnels were built, and it would kind of separate out the sediment and keep it separated. So this technological advance of these huge multi-ton rings is one of the reasons why they were able to do that. I should say demographically, it was a real mix. It was Black, West Indian, Italian, Irish, Polish. So you had a lot of different demographic groups who weren't necessarily used to working together now in this very contained space. The PRR took the safety of their workers very seriously. And they really tried to mitigate what I mentioned about the bends, so they had baths, coffee, warm clothes. There were some who died from doing this. There definitely were deaths from accidents, from the bends. Some was from worker negligence, and from smoking in the wrong places. But it wasn't as bad as it could have been because of a lot of this, and especially the shields, as I mentioned, that they had advancing, which were 200 tons. Let me just. So I want to get you a quote so that you could, kind of really understand it from a Sandhog standpoint. It's grueling. There's tremendous power down there that needs to be used. And if you're in the wrong spot at the wrong time, you're going to get crushed. And when you're in a confined space, there is nowhere to run. So just think about that and what that must have been like. And also, you don't even know if it's going to be successful, the project. Okay. So with the labor piece kind of mentioned, we have to talk about this other piece, which is about the PRR purchasing the Long Island Railroad, which they did. Now, so this was purchased from William Baldwin. William Baldwin Jr. Are you familiar with William Baldwin Jr., the president of the Long Island Railroad? Anyone? Okay. William Baldwin Jr. is kind of like, there could be a separate talk just on him. What he is most famous for is not even what we're going to talk about tonight, which is being president of the Long Island Railroad. He was very important in the early civil rights movement because he was white, but he gave a lot of money and time to educating former slaves and their families. And there was, I just mention because it's for a different time, he was very involved with Tuskegee University and the education of a lot of former slaves. But there was kind of a rift in the early civil rights movement because other civil rights activists felt that his approach was too passive, and they thought there should be more of an activist approach. And that their approach eventually became the NAACP, among other organizations. So that's for a different day, but I just wanted to mention that because I think that's important about him. Relevant to our talk today, he was friends with Alexander Cassatt, and lo and behold, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company buys the controlling stake in it, and Long Island Railroad becomes a part of the company, and the tunnels underneath the East River becomes very, very important. So the question then is about, there's this secret, right? Like nobody really knew if these tunnels would align. Nobody knew if they would hold up the weight from the trains, especially after a few months of wear and tear. This was a really terrible secret that Alexander Cassatt, Charles Jacobs, and Samuel Rey had. And if this didn't work out, pretty much the biggest company in the world could tank. And they had so much money invested in this, and there was so much debt that they were taking on. And at the end of the day, there really was no way to know. But before we even get to kind of withstand the weight of the trains, will the tunnels even align, right? Because we talked about building on the New Jersey side and the Manhattan side. So what we have is the tunnel alignment does happen under the Hudson River with 1/16 of an inch. Imagine that, by 1/16 of an inch. I have news for you. Engineers today, even by today's standards, say that's an absolutely amazing feat. I mean, with everything we just talked about, with all, the geysers and the blowouts and the compressed air. So just imagine how that was. So there was this huge celebration, right? And it was like 3 cheers for the Sandhogs. But you have to keep in mind, this is only the Hudson River. They still had to do the East River. Now, the East River was much harder, geologically. It was much harder to have tunnels there. So, on the East River, you can see this picture here. Okay, so the East River, the geysers started coming on the top of the river. And you can imagine these commuters on these boats were absolutely startled. And really, there was blowouts happening underneath the water. That's what the commuters didn't know. And the New York Times actually ran a story in June 1906, saying that there were blowouts that were occurring and there were deaths that were occurring. And this came because commuters were noticing, like there were like these huge geysers, and there was one incident where literally people were thrown out of the water from it. So what they start to get is a huge public relations headache. And this is a railroad company. They don't know anything about PR. They keep talking about these statistics. No one cares about their statistics. They're not even put in context. So what do? They hire a publicist. But in those days, there really wasn't the field of PR. And this was before World War I, when a lot of PR tactics were very much refined. So they hire Ivy Lee. Now, Ivy Lee is sort of known in the early PR field. And what he says is, you, PRR, you are telling the public these various statistics, right, so that they can kind of like appreciate the project. Yeah, forget that. That's not working. This is what you need to do. You need to humanize this. You need to create a story around it. And not only that, you're keeping everything this big secret. You're not letting anyone see what you're doing. You're afraid to show it to the public. I'm going to change that. I'm going to invite reporters to come down underneath the river and see for themselves. Now, in the PRR's defense, and this happens, of course, today, some of the reporting was inaccurate. Yes, there were deaths. Yes, there were accidents, but not at the numbers that were being reported. So they were kind of upset about it, as some can be like that today. So the New York Times, one quote is, "The geysers formed by the leaks have made the water in the ferry slips look like boiling lakes." So, the blowouts were causing injuries, the deaths were rising of some of the workers, and it was putting the project over budget and under schedule. So the PRR was really in a bind, but they thought this PR could help. So Ivy Lee invites a reporter. He goes underneath the water, and he sees the tunnels and understands what's really behind it. And it creates a really great story, right? No, that's not what happens. He's completely freaked out by going under the water. He can't handle it, and he's just like, I have to leave, and that's the end of their story. But they tried in other aspects to get some positive PR. So all of this kind of taken together is, I kind of created this diagram so you can kind of see what the PRR, all of their conflicts in one slide. So notice I put in the middle, tunnels not aligning. If you don't have this, you don't have anything. And they didn't know if they would align, especially on the East River. Also, there was no subway stop at the station. So the subway that begins in 1904, there's no promise that it's going to be at the Penn Station. And we know that it won't come until like 1917, 1918, but they don't know that then. We talked about the blowouts and dangers to Sandhogs, the skeptical media. The stock is tanking. That's another thing. These investors are getting very worried. We didn't talk about Mayor Seth Low, but he was basically a reformist mayor. And he worked very closely with the PRR and Alexander Cassatt to try to root out some of this corruption. But he's elected out of office. So, their guy in City Hall is no longer there. He's beaten out by a Tammany Hall candidate. And then you have some serious health issues. Unfortunately, Alexander Cassatt and also Charles McKim have some very significant health issues. Charles McKim is also having some major personal issues at home, which are affecting his job. And I mentioned about those property owner holdouts, right? So there's court challenges. You have to kind of go through all that, because remember, there's a point of no return. They have to get it all in order to build these stations. So sadly, in 1906, Alexander Cassatt dies. That's the sad part. He dies never knowing if the station would ever be built, never knowing if these tunnels would align. So he dies in a way of a broken heart because he's very disappointed that some PRR employees are indicted for kickback schemes. You remember I said they wanted to clean up a lot of the PRR, but he didn't. And a lot of it happened behind his back. He was loved by the railroad. but unfortunately never got to see a station or track. So there's this statue of him. But, you know, it's kind of sad because the statue is not even in the Penn Station that there is today. There still is a statue of him. It's in the Pennsylvania Railroad Museum in Pennsylvania. Okay. So, you know, things keep moving along even after he died. So you have this excavation site, right? Here is a portrayal of it. It's like a huge pit. It was called our own Panama Canal on the west side. And some spectators found this thrilling to watch. I mean, all these explosions, the removing of things, occasional explosions that reverberated throughout the neighborhood. I mean, imagine what that would have sounded like. There were these jolts, and some thought it was an earthquake. One thought Judgment Day had arrived. But eventually, they are able to build this, and there's the whole story in the book, which I won't get into here. But the station kind of magically comes about, and they say it was like having ancient Rome in your backyard. This was really something very special. It was Beaux-Arts style. It had 84 Greek Doric columns, 150 vaulted ceilings, the glass and ceiling soared to make one of the most breathtaking train sheds ever built. And yes, this was privately owned, but a lot of the public, as far as they were concerned, it was public for them. They felt like it was something that was theirs. And I have one quote from a witness to the opening of Penn Station, and she said that something to the effect of, I may not have come from much, but when I walked into Penn Station, I felt like this was made for me. And she said she felt like a queen. So this was what it was about, and it did have some structural, it wasn't all like perfect. Most architectural critics were very positive on it, but there were a few what were considered flaws. And in the Q&A, I could tell you about what some of those were. But one of them was just that, it took a long time to go from the departure level to kind of find your way about things. It wasn't like operationally streamlined, because that wasn't necessarily the huge objective. So this is the floor plan of the original Penn Station. You could see it's not that different from what you have now. You have the arcade. One thing about the arcade and the shops, that never really took off with different amazing shops that became a destination. In the early decades, you had a men's waiting room and a women's waiting room. And in the men's waiting room, you had shoe shine and you have Haircut. And then you had a lunchroom, and it was very elegant. And you also had a dinner and a dining room. And in ensuing decades, you had a lot of famous coffee shops and things. When I've done this talk in other venues, some audience members talk about some of their memories of that and some of the different coffee shops and so on. And then of course you have the general waiting room and the concourse. So again, not too dissimilar to what there is today, the basic framework. So you have the waiting room, the sun kind of pouring in, the high arches. You don't really have seats, as you might think about with a waiting room. And you have the concourse, and you have the departure level, and then you have the arrival level below that. And the arrival level was very much towards getting you out into the city, and it almost had its own community. Because 3 years after, in 1913, you have the post office, which was across the street, and you also have, just a few years later, the Hotel Pennsylvania, which once was going to be on top of Penn Station, because they wanted the rental income. So that actually was going to be on the roof. Cassatt and McKim, all these guys, they said, no way, we're not doing that. And they kind of had this big argument about it. But they finally decided that structurally, there was no way that the station could hold up. So they didn't have to have it like that. There were also department stores that kind of evolved around that area. There's also the famous clock, right, which I think a lot of you are familiar with, in this clock and station. There's a movie in 1942 with Judy Garland called The Clock, which shows some scenes in Penn Station. It was filmed in a soundstage, but they replicated a lot of things well, and some of the exterior, so you can watch that. It's not a good movie. I'm not recommending the movie. You skip the plot. It's ridiculous. It's corny. But see it for the shots of Penn Station, even if it's from a soundstage. Okay, so now in the first decade, there are some unanticipated issues. First and foremost, which plagued them even to today. But you can't blame them. It makes sense. They totally underestimated the commuter traffic. And, because they really thought about long-distance travel. So they didn't think they were going to have all of that. So it very much underserviced the Long Island Railroad passengers, okay? No subway stop. That's a major deal to have no subway stop. The subway stop didn't come until like 1918. The development of the neighborhood. Remember we talked about that and the gentrification? Not happening in the speed that the executives were hoping. And I read telegrams between them and letters basically saying like, I thought this neighborhood was going to develop more quickly than it has. You also have, shortly after the station, the most important event of the century, or decade certainly, World War I. And during World War I, which was not uncommon, the government nationalized the station. So then it took this very practical importance of once the US entered World War I to transport troops and equipment. And that was okay, but it definitely had a lot of wear and tear on the station as well. Well, by the 1920s, it kind of goes back to being like the golden age of railroads. And I talk in the book about, some kind of funny stories of like famous in like the railroad world of like the cooks, of like some baggage handlers who are really well known and passengers would ask for them. And you also started to have advertising, which was very much about like the modern comforts, the travel for enjoyment, celebrities like Charlie Chaplin going on the train and many others. And you also start to see advertisements with the train combined with what? With what? Airplanes. Thank you. Yes, sir. So at the in Detroit, how many of you have been to the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit? Some of you. Okay. So you may remember there's advertising that they show in their exhibit on exactly that. It would be like an ad that you want to get from New York City to LA. So it'd be like showing someone riding in style in the train, and they go to the Midwest, and then you board a plane. And it would kind of show them in this like little plane, and these hostesses that are trying to like, keep everyone happy. And then you would like land in like Oklahoma or around there, and then you would like take another train. So it'd be kind of like this train-airplane combination. So the point being, now they're thinking about cross-country travel, and it might take like a few days. But that would be considered much shorter then. So, the 20s was a time, the Roaring 20s, the Jazz Age. It was a time of great building in the city, and the railroad's profits are soaring at this point. But then, of course, the Great Depression hits. So I will kind of leave it. I won't go over all these different periods in this talk, but you can learn in the book about what the Depression did to the station. Remember, the Great Depression disproportionately affected New York City than other places. And also, not only in terms of the decrease of commuters and passengers, but also of freight, of the freight lines. And eventually, when we get to World War II, this is a place of great emotion. This is where a lot of families are saying goodbye to their loved ones who are going to be serving overseas. Honestly, not knowing for sure whether they'll ever see them again. Also, when the war is over, some of them are, all the scenes that you've seen and the photos around Penn Station. So it's serviced as kind of, this really important destination for that. There's a quote that I wanted to read. I just abbreviated, but I just wanted to, put some color in this. So this is Thomas Wolfe, the early 20th century writer, not the more modern one that people think of, like Tom Wolfe. We're not talking about him. And I just took a few sentences because I think it'll kind of paint what this was like. So he's talking about the waiting room. The station was murmurous with the immense space and distant sound of time. Here, as nowhere else on earth, travelers were brought together for a moment for the beginning or end of their innumerable journeys. Here, one saw their greetings and farewells. Here, in a single instant, one got the entire picture of human destiny. Passengers came and went. They passed and vanished. All were moving through the moments of their lives. But the voice of time remained aloof and unperturbed, a drowsy and eternal murmur below the immense and distant roof. So wanted to give you kind of that color. Now, and just have a few more minutes here. I'm going to leave you in suspense about the final decades. The 1950s, okay? This changes. You have competition from the airplane. This whole thing with the train and the plane, it never really took off. It was never that successful. It was okay, but it wasn't like as profitable as they were hoping for. The substitution of the automobile. So you know that the automobile with the Model T on a mass production level, 1908, eventually became the car in 1914. So you might say, why is he putting up in 1950s? Because it was really here that it was on a mass level and a whole highway system to support that. This was a problem for a railroad. They had to really reinvent themselves. You also have high equipment and maintenance cost. They also felt very picked on, the Pennsylvania Railroad. They felt they were paying higher taxes than others, and that they were all these regulations. And I read a lot of things like, I don't see you making regulations on the airline industry, on the auto industry. Why are you picking on us? And they actually felt that they were doing this great service because this was all privately owned. And they were proud of that. They said, we're not even getting government subsidies, but you're making our business very difficult. So I found a lot of that in kind of looking at the letters of these archives. Well, this is a financial loss for the railroad. So when they start losing money, they start panicking. And they decide that what they need to do is, and this was the wrong decision, both from an architectural preservation standpoint and also from a business standpoint. But as we look at history, it's important to consider the other side, even if it wasn't correct. What they would have said if they were standing here is, we have no choice. We're losing money, and we want to enter into partnerships. And so they interviewed all these different partners, and they had Madison Square Garden to get some of the air rights. So there were protests, like the Action Group for Better Architecture, right? But ultimately, they were very small protests. They were no match, the protesters versus all the forces for it. Because this was before a lot of the awareness about architectural preservation. We have to remember that in the early 1960s, Carnegie Hall was going to be torn down. Because they say, we're having Lincoln Center. The market's not going to bear both. Which, they were wrong. A lot of these things were wrong, but they didn't think like that. There were a tremendous number of buildings being torn down in the city. So they would have looked at it, and I'm not saying this is right, but I'm just trying to show how they would have thought about it. They basically said, our job is to protect our shareholders. And not to, the architecture is great, but we need to break even or make a profit. And so they made the decision to do that. The unions were very much for this project because they looked at it as these are like more jobs. So there wasn't really that many protests. And the destruction starts, you can read about it more in the book, but I thought this was really sad about the eagle, the eagles that are being removed over several years. Because remember, the station had to stay open, right? That's why it took many years from the initial destruction throughout the mid-1960s. Now here's the thing, okay? From a business standpoint, this was the wrong move too, because the Pennsylvania Railroad Company really did not get what they should have from these partnerships. They are a railroad company. They don't know that much about partnerships. And the contracts that they signed had a lot of loopholes in it. And they didn't vet them like they should have. And so they didn't get the profit sharing that they thought they would. And eventually, they combined with the New York Central Railway, and it ends up going bankrupt. So there is a quote here from Vincent Scully, kind of famous professor of art, and you can read, this is one of the most famous quotes about it. Through at Penn Station, went through the sea like a god, one scuttles in now like a rat. So in terms of like what they built later, now this, one thing I will say, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested, this did help bring about the landmark and movement, also just the awareness about it, and also legally. Because by the time we get to the late 1960s, Grand Central is in danger, right? A lot of you know about Jackie Onassis Kennedy and a lot of her efforts. So there's a big difference between the early 60s and late 60s when it comes to this. Now there was a lot of pushback because I think no one realized what they were giving up until it was too late. So with Grand Central, there was a lot of pushback and there was a lot of court challenges. So it was basically like the city of New York versus the New York Central Railway, which now has a part of this with it. And it wound its way through the court system. And I write about a lot of the court testimony that I found. But ultimately, in the US Supreme Court, the city prevails. And this gives landmark status. It also gives standing to communities around the country. It's not just New York. This is also when you start to see a lot more preservation around the country. So a good example of this, a very good example of this, is Miami Beach, the Art Deco hotels, right? Those were going to be torn down too, because Miami Beach was in a huge decline. So then you have Barbara Kaplan, who's from New York and was influenced by all this. She comes down and starts this whole Miami Design Preservation League, and they try to put a stop to it. And you also just have a lot of towns across the country saying, wait, they won this lawsuit? You mean we actually have some standing? And it kind of changes the game in a lot of ways. So, with that, there's there's also questions about like what remains. So I'll just tell you very briefly, and then we will stop and do some questions, and then we'll do some signing. So just very quickly, there is, right by the storage room in the current Penn Station is a plaque to the baggage handlers who served in World War II from 1948. You know about the power plant, some of the original staircases and the railings. Inside the kitchen at Zaro's Bread Basket, there's a small stretch of the kitchen that has the original brick floor that survives. You also have on the Long Island Railroad waiting room, the original gate. And you have also the statue. So statue of Samuel Rey. That's who it is on 7th Avenue. When you walk down 7th Avenue, that's who you're seeing, Samuel Rey. You do have a lot of the eagles, which are pretty much from Maine to like, I think as far out as Kansas City, but 2 of them are in Penn Station. There's one in the Long Island Railroad Station too. Some of the original signs. So I just wanted to kind of give you that sense. And now, of course, you know about the new project, the Moynihan Train Hall. So this is a rendering of that. So, we don't get too much into that in this talk, but I just wanted to, let you know what's happening there. It's going to increase the concourse space by 50%. It'll handle Long Island Railroad and Amtrak. And it's going to be like this destination for a lot of shopping, for a lot of businesses. They're trying to get a lot of these tech companies. And it will have some of the original elements on it, which you can read about. So, with that said, I will conclude here. I will definitely take some questions. We have this book for sale. It's $21 in the back in Penn Station. Also these other books which, kind of deal with some of this, like the Henry Street Settlement and about New York and South Florida as well. So you can see me about that. So with that, that's what I got. Thanks. 1 second.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a microphone here, so if you could please wait until the microphone reaches you and make sure to speak directly into it so we can capture your question on the recording. Thank you.
Hi, Paul. Thanks a lot. I was wondering, how deep were those tunnels on the Hudson River and the East River? Do you know how far they had to go down?
I don't have the measurements of how far it had to go down, but one thing I can tell you is they were really worried about it because it wasn't holding steady, and they couldn't figure out why. And they hired all these engineering firms to try to look at it, and no one could figure out why. Was it not deep enough? The answer was so simple. It was that the tide of the river is what was shifting it. So they had to kind of like reconfigure how these tunnels were sort of like aligned and sort of fastened.
Are those the same tunnels being used today?
Yeah.
Okay.
Paul, thank you. I actually have a question for the gentleman that you acknowledged in terms of his photos being in the book, and I just wanted to know the circumstances surrounding the photos. Was the station being torn down when you took the photos, or were they when the station was intact?
Okay. Yeah, I'm Norman McGrath. And at the time that the demolition of Pennsylvania commenced, I was employed by a structural engineering company that had its offices on the 16th floor of the Pennsylvania Hotel. And at that time, I lived on 30th Street between Lexington and Park. So I was a short walk from the station. So I couldn't ignore what was going on right across the street, even if I'd wanted to, and I didn't. And at that time, I took a course with a marvelous teacher named Alexei Brodovich, who was very interesting. He was the art director of Harper's Bazaar, and he was very influential on a lot of photographers who were my contemporaries, and including people like Irving Penn and Richard Avedon. And in fact, the classes were given in Avedon's studio. But not to digress, he encouraged all of us to produce work that had originality, not a copy of something else, and then we would discuss the projects that we chose to do in front of the class, and so on. And of course, my choice was the demolition of Penn Station. So I started to photograph the station because it was common knowledge that it was going to happen, and at the time. And so I started to take some photographs of the station even before the demolition. But as part of my documentation, I figured it was the simplest thing to do was to do it in 35 millimeter format with slides, because I wanted to make a presentation which would be easy to show to a group and that I could then discuss with various people. And and the odd thing was that most of the other photographers who including Aaron Rose, for example, whose photographs are with the Museum of the City of New York, a well-known photographer, that everybody did it in black and white. I was the only one that seemed to be doing it in color. And to my knowledge, I'm the only person now around, certainly, that has photographs of the demolition of the station, the way it was, in color. And I did it strictly on spec, unofficially. And that meant, with a station as vast as Penn Station, it was huge. It was out of the question to make this a station which was in which unwanted people couldn't intrude. You just pulled back a tarp and you went into the guts of the station, and I would spend hours climbing through all the different levels of the station with Aaron and with other friends, and never ever got challenged. Never once.
Right.
So I have 4 years worth, really, of photographs,
Great.
Hundreds of them, of the demolition of the station.
Great,
So,
terrific, thanks. Okay. Yeah.
You introduced the idea that they wanted to build this station before they even knew they were going to be able to do the tunnels. Is that actually the way that happened? Because then they were the worst company in the world to have tried to build the station before they knew that they could get those tunnels.
They certainly had plans to do the tunnels. This was Charles Jacobs who was in charge of it, absolutely. He certainly had all the drawings, all the diagrams, all of the research, yes. But the truth is, he nor no other engineer could have said with certainty, no one could have, that it would actually work. So yes, they had a plan. Yes, it was very well thought out. But having your plan and making sure that it actually works are two completely different things. It also shows the enormous risk that they took, which is really something to think about, in fairness, in sort of honoring that. Okay. How much time do we have as a time check?
7:40 now.
Okay. Yeah, so whatever you say as far as the time that we have left. 2 more questions? Okay. All right, so we have 2 more. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for an excellent lecture. 2 questions. One, in terms of corruption, how did Cassatt and Pennsylvania Railroad compete with Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilts, in terms of corruption? Were they facing the same level of pressure, or because they had a long-term presence in New York, did they have some degree of protection from that? And secondly, in terms of the heavy regulation after post-World War II, how do they compete with the car companies, which basically had a very successful lobby, whereas they were getting screwed?
2 great questions. So as far as the first one, in terms of competing with Vanderbilt and Grand Central, that was a real problem for them. So notice the Grand Central as we know it today, this version, 1913, 3 years later it goes up. They kind of had deeper pockets in a way, Grand Central. The Vanderbilts were more connected to sort of the underworld of New York City, kind of really understanding how it works. Sure, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company tried lots of things. I have to say, and I have no relation to any of these people. I'm just the person, speaking about it for you. I would have to say Vanderbilt was less ethical. I mean, he was okay with taking a lot of shortcuts. He was okay with some of the corruption. I mean, Cassatt, I'm not saying everyone at the Pennsylvania Railroad Company felt this way, but I could say Cassatt very much wanted to root out a lot of the corruption, and that would be a competitive disadvantage. Vanderbilt also turned, and his descendants, we're talking about William, obviously, at this point, not just Cornelius, but turned a blind eye to a lot of the kickbacks and so on that they were seeing. So I think it was a competitive disadvantage. As far as your question about the car, that was a real problem because, as I mentioned, they tried to incorporate the car into the advertising and the long-distance railroad, but they never really were able to compete with the idea of an automobile as a substitution. For New York City, they are, one advantage they had was because it was and still is so hard to drive into New York, and with the traffic and with parking, going on the train as a commuter is much easier. I think that's something they could have played up much more, like almost from an advertising standpoint, because cars were so sexy at the time. But they could have. I didn't see much advertising copy that really kind of showed why this would be a better alternative. Also, with the Long Island Railroad passengers feeling kind of underserviced, like, oh, I don't like this waiting room. This is sort of like disorganized. I should also say that Penn Station was falling into some disrepair. It wasn't like this beautiful. It was beautiful, but it did have more problems as time went on with homelessness. During the Depression, there was a lot that went on with it. Got the beautiful white limestone. It was very easy for it to collect dirt. So and they built these things in the 50s in it, which were very unsightly. So, we also have to not over-idealize it either and look at some reasons why someone would have seen the car as a viable alternative, certainly at any other place than here. Thank you for that question. Last question. You choose.
Thank you. At the close to the conclusion of your talk, you referred to the power station.
Right.
And I remember about 10 years ago being on the south side of Penn Station, and there is this strange building in the middle of the block that I believe was one of those facilities. Is that part of Penn Station? And
Yeah.
does it have is there any initiative to save that in some way as a
Right.
historic element?
Yes, thank you for that question. So the power plant is sort of this mysterious building, right? It's part of like this old kind of like set of buildings. Some of it has this utilitarian function, but it's like this almost industrial building, and a lot of that building is kind of in disuse. Now, I gave a talk at the Harvard Club last week, actually, funny enough, right across the street, and in that talk, they had the president of the company that's basically in charge of building the new Penn Station, and I asked him about the power plant and what their plans were with it. He said that they basically not much at this point, and the reason why is it has a lot of contaminated materials inside, and it's not like totally safe. And he said in so many words, I mean, I'm totally paraphrasing, but he basically said, like, we don't want to deal with it. Like, we have so much else to think about in building this and everything we need to do. Like, we're just going to let the PowerPoint. Now, I think in a future iteration, so I'm not talking about like in a year and a half or 2 years, I think in the next, say, decade or 2 decades, something will happen with that. And they'll realize how important the real estate is and all of that, and they'll kind of like incorporate it as part of it. But that definitely will not happen for another 10 or 15 years. Okay, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I just ask you to just hold on 1 second? Paul, that was just fantastic. You are a mine of information, and you presented it in the most eloquent and entertaining way, and we greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise and all your research. So thank you very, very much, really. In recognition of you speaking here this evening, we would like to honor you with a citation, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dengel.
Thank you. And Paul, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to you, Paul M. Kaplan, for New York's original Penn Station, the rise and tragic fall of an American landmark, for his participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.
And because Paul is a prolific writer, and because Paul expressed such a love for our library upon being introduced to it yesterday, we have made you a lifetime member of the library.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Oh my gosh. Oh, thank you very much.
And plenty of research here, because as we always say, our archives go back to 1785, but we also have New York Times bestsellers. So, and I just want to thank our audience, because we have a wonderful audience tonight, as we always do, but especially this audience, for so many of you who care about preservation in New York and the Landmarks Conservancy. We have many members here, and Peg Breen and all of her team there. And I thought of something. I've been coming to this building for a long time, and as you were speaking, I just thought how grateful I am to all of the New Yorkers, including this building, the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. You are in a building. This is an extension. It used to be the front of the building. This was an open courtyard. And when I take people on tours, I always say the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, through its architects, the original one being Lamb and Rich in 1890 and Ralph Townsend in 1903, when then member Andrew Carnegie gave us money to build this library and put 2 floors on the building. And those windows on the balcony that we invite you to go up and explore, those were all conserved. And I say the General Society was conducting historic preservation before it was a term. And that was 1903, and they conserved the windows, made them doors, and this beautiful library was created, which we love and care for so much. So it really is, there's lots of great stories out there about people who care, including all of the people here tonight. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.